But even someone like Charles Murray, who you've had, I know, on your
I have.
blogging head, yeah, and I admire, no, and nobody admires Charles Murray more than I do. I think he's a master demographer and a very brilliant and original thinker. But I was very disappointed with his book, Facing Reality. It starts out a very promising way. He just reports the facts and he talks about what he thinks the implications of the facts are. What does he talk about? He talks about the gap in academic achievement and in cognitive ability that we measure between blacks and whites, and we still measure. That's the first thing. And, the so-called IQ gap. And then he talks about the higher rates of crime in the black community and how that has ramifications
Right.
Across all different areas. And I think he's absolutely right about that. Avoiding crime is a huge motivator for a lot of people, right? But then in the last chapter, he bizarrely pulls his punches. And instead of saying the left is the problem, wokeness is the problem, we have to attack this kind of multicultural identity politics, which is coming out of the left and is poisoning everything. Instead of saying that and saying, and you know what? If we go back to the American creed, which is impartial, colorblind meritocracy, we are not going to see equal outcomes. Get over it. We've got to face up to it. Instead of saying that, which is what he should have said, he says, but the real problem is white identity politics, which I find completely inexplicable.
Well, let me try to explain. I mean, I first of all, he starts the book by extolling the American creed. That's how he starts the book. The first chapter is not about demography. The first chapter is about the American creed. And the second chapter is also, in a way, not about numbers. It's about how do we think about identity. It's about who are the different groups and how do we think about it. He worries that if we don't face reality, the consequence will be the development of a white identity politics, which is bad for the country. I think that's correct, actually. I think both the prognosis that the long run implication of wokeness is white identity politics. If you can't categorically condemn whiteness, I think, without inducing a pride and ownership of whiteness amongst the people who are resisting your categorical condemnation. So this is not good for the country.
I agree with all of that.
So he doesn't make your argument; he makes his argument. But what?
No, Glenn. No, here's what he says. He ignores the fact that we've got identity politics out the wazoo. There is nothing else now but it is all non-white identity politics. Our society is dominated by the imperatives of non-white identity politics. So for him to say, but it will be 100 times worse, the real tragedy, the real danger is white identity politics. I
don't know that that's the real danger. I think he thinks that that's the worst thing that can happen. That's where we're headed.
That's what he's saying.
But it's an implicit indictment of identity politics to court, not just white identity politics. He's saying that's the end of this sorrowful path that you guys have marked out for ourselves. And if you face up to reality, that is to say, if you take seriously the parts of the book that you described, where he carefully documents the test score gap and carefully documents the criminal offending gap, you would, of course, I mean, you wouldn't be a leftist if you were to take seriously the parts of the book that he's trying to get you to take seriously. If we were to talk about crime and punishment or talk about educational achievement in the way that Charles Murray wants us to, I think we'd have to reject the left-wing identity politics.
Right, but he, instead of saying, well, our first task is to reject left-wing identity politics, and it is the left that needs to accomplish that task. But I still think that he exaggerates the quote unquote danger of white identity politics. And here's the problem with his whole indictment. He doesn't define white identity politics. He names not a single group that he thinks is pushing white identity politics. He names not a single person who is advocating for white identity politics. He doesn't list their belief system. I mean, it's just a kind of a lot of hand waving.
Okay.
focusing on this term, which is a term that the left made up. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't groups that are focused on white interests. So let's take American Renaissance, which I think is certainly not by any means the most extreme, quote unquote, extreme group out there. They're, they say they're advocating for the interests of white people in society where white people are under siege. And, I happen to know the head of American Renaissance. His name is Jared Taylor, and he's a very refined, highly educated guy who, is very well informed and the like. And if you read my essay, but I actually asked him point blank, like, do you advocate for going back to anything like Jim Crow, like double standards, like white people have more privileges than everybody else, or anything like that? He said, no, we'd be happy with the American creed. We'd be perfectly satisfied if we could just return to something like the color blindness that we had for a brief and shining moment after the Civil Rights Act, at least in law, in policy, in politics, maybe not in informal interactions, but certainly officially, we had that brief and shining moment of color blindness before we went off on this tangent about equality of results. He says, but we recognize that because of the differences in orientation and ability, that, whites would be very influential in our society. They would dominate in a lot of fields. And that's what woke people call white supremacy, right? So I'm not sure that Murray and Taylor are that far apart in what they perceive to be the outcomes from the American creed. So why is Murray condemning him?
Investing in the well-being of white people creates, in Murray's view, as I understand it, this idea that there are white interests, the idea that whites would come to see themselves as a collectivity in the same way that people of color, quote unquote, are doing, that their politics would be organized around their whiteness, is bad for the country. It takes us further and further down the identitarian road. And the end of that process is division and conflict in the country.
Well, it's reactive. I think that white people have been.
Let me just say this, Amy.
Into a corner.
Let me just say this. Okay, so the left have made a big deal out of white cops killing black youngsters. It would be easy to make a big deal out of black thugs killing innocent white people. Very easy, because there are a lot of white people killed by black people. You could have a website. It may well exist. It may well exist. You could have a website where every day of the year was dedicated to an innocent white person who had been ravaged, home invaded, carjacked, randomly sliced with a knife at a subway station, shot at 2 o'clock in the morning because they were walking along the wrong street at the wrong time. You could easily do it. Easily. You could take the Waukesha massacre, where a white town, I've been to Waukesha, Wisconsin. It's the most Republican county in the state of Wisconsin. It looks like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. It's a very, very white place. They're having a Christmas parade. A black man with a rap sheet a mile long drives a vehicle into that crowd, kills grandmothers, dancing grannies, they call themselves. And I think 2 or 3 of them actually got killed by this guy. Dozens were injured. He mowed down a parade of white people with a vehicle. Now, that could easily be interpreted. I don't know if Jared Taylor talks like this, but I could hear him saying it. Black thug let out on by one of these George Soros loving prosecutors who are getting rid of pretrial detention and not bringing cases against property crimes that are below a certain level, and are basically throwing the jail doors open. And one of those people who was let out on a $1,000 bond for a crime that he should have been held for mowed down a parade of white people. A black racist. You look at his Facebook posts and whatnot. This is Daryl Brooks. And apparently he doesn't like white people, and he mowed them down. Now, that's a crime against white people. White people need to defend themselves. That's the kind of talk that I could hear Jared Taylor engaging in. I don't know if he said it or not, but that's what Charles Murray. Okay, then more power to Jared Taylor. Let me not malign him. It's not about him. That's what Charles is worried about. He's worried about an American politics in which you mobilize white people against the depredations of these vicious criminals who happen to be black, who are black thugs in the minds of the demagogue who's going to be pushing this political line, and says, if white people don't defend ourselves, these are militias. They're going to get armed. They're going to end up in conflict with people. Then no one else will. You see what the politicians are doing? The politicians are siding with the black thugs. We white people need to defend ourselves. Now, if that's not bad for America, I don't know what is, Amy.